Hi class, how are you today? If you said good, then that's great! You'll understand the joke after you watch the video. The learning target for today is to write and understand conditional statements and their variations. So at this point you probably don't even know what a conditional statement is. The basics are that you'll write if something, then something. So if one thing happens, then something else has to happen. And that's the kind of thing you're going to write about today. So before we jump in, here's the scale. You're at a 3 if you can write and understand conditional statements and their variations. Their variations we'll learn about in a bit, but they're the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. 2, you can write and understand conditional statements. And when I say understand, it kind of goes to what a 1 is. You can identify the parts of a conditional statement. And a 0, you do not understand conditional statements. Let's get started. Alright, so if-then statements are written like this. If P, something happening P, then Q, something happening that's Q. So if P happens, then Q has to happen. That's how it works. It's also often written like this. That's an arrow, by the way. And so this also says if P, then Q. Or in another way, P implies Q. But if P happens, then Q has to happen. So first, here's an example of a conditional statement. If an animal is a fish, then it lives in water. So all fish live in water, right? So this saying, if an animal is a fish, then it must live in water. So there's two parts of this conditional statement. First is the P part, the if P. And that is the hypothesis. So if an animal is a fish, so if it is a fish, then we can conclude with the Q that it lives in water. So that's the conclusion. So first part is the hypothesis, which is if an animal is a fish, and the last part is the conclusion, then it lives in water. Alright, so next I want you to take a sentence and turn it into a conditional statement, an if-then statement. So let's look at this. So we have here, the Patriots will play in the Super Bowl if they win the AFC Championship. So they already give you the if part, if they win the AFC Championship. So that part we can just write down. So if the Patriots win the AFC Championship, and after that we know there's going to be a then something else has to happen. If they win the AFC Championship, then, well, what was the other part? The Patriots will play in the Super Bowl. So then they will play in the Super Bowl. All right, let's look at one more. Babies are illogical. So only 3 words, but we can still turn this into a conditional statement, an if-then statement. So babies are illogical. So first we're talking about babies. So that means in order for this to work, someone has to be a baby. So that's the thing we're assuming, the hypothesis. So if you are a baby, after that we'll have a then, and then the other part. Babies are illogical. So if you are a baby, then you are illogical. So next we're going to talk about ways that we can change a conditional statement. So the first is about the parts of a conditional statement, and it's negating them, negation. So that's to essentially to put not in front of whatever you're saying. So first you would write it in the form like this or like this. I've seen it set up both ways, but both of those are saying not P. So what that means is you're just taking whatever P is and saying not in front of it. So in the last example we had for P, if you are a baby, this would mean if you are not a baby. So it's just putting not somewhere in there to give you the opposite of the statement. So for the rest of these, we're going to take our usual conditional statement, the ones we've been dealing with, if P, then Q, and we're going to change them. So here's how you would write these. First, we have the converse, which switches P and Q. So instead of if P, then Q, we have if Q, then P. And I'll go back to the last statement again. We'll do a few examples of these in a second, but this one, if you are a baby, then you are illogical, would switch to if you are illogical, then you are a baby. They're not always true by doing the converse, but sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Same with the rest of these coming up. Next we have the inverse, which just negates both P and Q. So this is saying if not P, then not Q. So just like we were saying on the other example, if you are a baby, then you are illogical. This one says if you are not a baby, then you are not illogical. Again, not always necessarily true. The contrapositive does both. They switch them and they negate them. So this one says if not Q, then not P. So take the statement again before. If you are a baby, then you are illogical. So if you are not illogical, then you are not a baby. Alright, so in the next example, we're going to change these. So change a conditional statement into a converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So make sure you have these written down, and let's move on. Alright, let's look at this statement now. If you are in 9th grade, then you are in high school. So I want you to turn this statement into its converse, its inverse, and its contrapositive, and say whether or not each of those are true. So first, let's look at this one. Is this one true? If you are in 9th grade, then you are in high school. Yeah, I do believe that is right. So, true. Now let's look at the converse. The converse would say the opposite. So the converse would say, if you are in high school, because we do the last part first, then you are in 9th grade. So, let's look at this. If you are in high school, then you are in 9th grade. Well, if you're in high school, you could be in 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th grade. So, no, that's not always true. It's sometimes true, but not always. So, we say that it's false. Alright, so I made it smaller so we could fit it all on one page and look at it. So, now let's do it with the inverse. Remember, the inverse keeps it in the same order, but negates each statement. So it would be, if you are not in 9th grade, then you are not in high school. Well, if you're not in 9th grade, you could be in 10th grade, 11th grade, or 12th grade, in which case you would still be in high school. So, once again, we say it's false. And then finally, the contrapositive, which switches it and negates it. So, switches it, so we put high school first, then the 9th grade, and we put not in front of both. So, if you are not in high school, then you are not in 9th grade. So let's think about that one. If you're not in high school, then you are not in 9th grade. Well, we already said that if you are in 9th grade, then you're in high school. So if you are not in 9th grade, or if you're, not in high school, then there's no way you can be in 9th grade. So that one is true. So if we look here, the original conditional statement is true, the converse was false, the inverse was false, and the contrapositive was true. Sometimes you can have it where they all end up being true. Alright, now time for the sponge. I want you to write the following statement as a conditional statement, then write its converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So, for the statement, I get a bonus point on the next test when I correctly complete the sponge activity. So I want you to turn that statement into a conditional statement. Then, after you've turned it into a conditional statement, write its converse, inverse, and contrapositive. That's it for the video. Once again, don't forget to take notes in the entire lesson. Attempt the sponge activity. Make sure to rate yourself on the scale. Take a picture of your notes and the sponge and submit them all to eBackpack. Have a good night.